Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I have the pleasure of presenting this afternoon, so lots of the other amazing talks today have already set the stage quite nicely. But today I'll be talking about running a study within a trial, or a SWAT, as I'll refer to it for the remaining of the presentation, and particularly in the complex trial design context. So just briefly, we'll talk a little bit about what is a SWAT, talk about some considerations specific to the complex trial design context, and then I'll share hopefully some helpful considerations from my experience running a SWAT in a complex trial. So as I'm sure we're all well aware and has been discussed already many times today, clinical trials really form the foundation for evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine. They inform the care that we provide to patients and policy decisions. However, quite often the processes that we use to conduct our clinical trials are not evidence-based. So they're informed by previous experience or intuition, logistics, and not actually informed by what we know might be best practices for the processes for our clinical trials. This is really important because ineffective or inefficient trial conduct can have negative impacts on our trials. So it can increase trial cost, it can increase the length of time required to complete our trials, and sometimes it can actually compromise study completion. All of this can potentially contribute to research waste, which has been already highlighted previously today. And ultimately, it decreases the value of the money that we put into our clinical trials, the time, and importantly, the participant or the patient contributions to our clinical trials. So to address this, we have the SWAT methodology. So very briefly, for those who might not be familiar, what is a SWAT? A SWAT is a self-contained study that's embedded in what we call a host trial. So the host trial itself, such as the platform trials that have been mentioned today, look at evaluating a clinical intervention or interventions or program. The SWAT, however, evaluates the trial processes themselves. And SWATs are intended to improve the efficiency of the way we conduct our clinical trials. On screen here, this is just a very crude search of PubMed indexed publications for the term study within a trial. And as you can see, this is a relatively new area, still quite niche, but you can see that over the 10 years, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of increasing activity in the area of SWATs, which I think is really important because it shows that we're starting to recognize that the processes for our trials are just as important as the interventions that we're studying. SWATs can really be conducted on any part of the trial process that we're not quite sure how to best approach. But there's definitely been some key areas that have emerged over the last 10 years or so for SWAT research. So I'll highlight some of those, which again have already been highlighted in some of the PhD work that was presented earlier. One of the biggest areas for SWATs is looking at recruitment, so how we're going about approaching patients or families to enroll in our trials. And a lot of the recruitment studies are focused on different types of communication techniques. What's really unique in this area is there's actually one of few meta-analyses that look at different approaches to recruiting patients into trials. So really cool that we're starting to see some meta-analyses come out of the SWATs that are occurring as well. I also wanted to highlight that there's been some priority setting initiatives in the areas of recruitment. So this is really important as we're moving forward. There's been like the top questions identified in terms of uncertainties moving forward for future research. So great to look at these as we start looking at questions to address moving forward. Similar to recruitment, retention is also one of the big areas for SWAT research. Again, a lot of the SWATs that are occurring in this area focus on different types of communication or some incentives, as we've heard about previously. And again, there's also been priority setting in this area as well. So really important that we consider these as we move forward with our research in this area. Informed consent is a really popular area right now, and where I've been fortunate to do some work as well. And again, looking at making the way that we talk about our trials to patients and families in a more patient or family-centered way, so that things can be a little bit easier to understand and a little bit more approachable in that process. Data quality and management, so looking at improving the way that we're collecting and managing our data and even managing our trials themselves. So there's been some really cool SWATs that look at trial management and leadership and teamwork and the way that that impacts the way that trials are conducted. Site training is another popular area, and this one's really important as well. Things like looking at on-site training, which has been kind of the norm historically, I think, versus things like remote training. So as we heard about earlier, thinking about the environmental impact of our clinical trials and trying to reduce that, as well as reduce the cost of running clinical trials. Training is a really unique area for SWATs. And finally, fidelity and adherence. There's been, I would say, a smaller number in this area, but really important work, again, to look at the way that we can help both patients and trial staff comply with our trial protocols. There's several really important methodological considerations for SWATs, but I just wanted to take a moment to highlight a few here for you. And first and foremost, I think that to the best of our ability, we should try not to interfere with the conduct or the integrity of host trials themselves when we're running our SWATs. So we really want to make sure that we're integrating as seamlessly as possible and working with trial staff to be able to do that. SWATs should have self-contained protocols and publications. We should make these also publicly available as much as we can. And also important to remember that SWATs may also need their own independent ethics approval, so remembering to consider that up front. And although one of the advantages of SWATs is typically they can be done with fewer resources and funding than perhaps the host trial itself, it's important to remember that typically there will still be some cost and resources associated with them, which can be harder to find for smaller amounts of money. So looking for some unique grant calls, which there are more and more of now, either for SWATs or research on research, or also considering our SWATs upfront and embedding it in grant applications and funding for host trials themselves. And then lastly, similar to clinical trials themselves, individual SWATs often will lack the power to answer questions that can ultimately inform best practice. So thinking about things like meta-analyses moving forward, as we saw with our retention SWATs. There's lots of great SWAT resources out there, and I just wanted to share a few that have been really helpful for me in my journey. I'm sure that most of you in the room have heard of TrialForge, but this group is ultimately, from my perspective, one of the leaders in the area of SWAT research, and a really great place to go for anything SWAT related. The Northern Ireland Hub for Trials Methodology Research has what's called a SWAT store. So this is a place that you can actually register your SWAT protocols. So as I mentioned previously, we really want to make sure that we're making these publicly available, and a great place that you can register and also see what SWATs are ongoing. And then lastly, just wanted to share that the TrialForge has also put out a guidance document around reporting SWATs. So if we're thinking about things like meta-analyses, making sure that we're reporting things in a way that data can be combined and implemented by researchers moving forward. So now I'd like to pivot a little bit just to highlight some considerations for you in terms of conducting a SWAT in a complex trial. So I'll use the adaptive platform trial as the complex trial for consideration. And I won't talk about this too much because I think it's already been really nicely described by several other speakers this morning. But just wanted to highlight that when we're thinking about the platform trial design, we have the single patient group with multiple potential interventions. We have multiple interim analyses that are ultimately informing things like response adaptive randomization and the addition and dropping of treatment arms. So this is a really complex environment that I think presents really important benefits or opportunities, but also important challenges for conducting SWATs. So first, to highlight some of the key benefits from my perspective that, again, I think will mirror some of the previous talks, but we've learned today that platform trials typically recruit over long periods of time. So this provides a lot of opportunity for us to look at process or methodological type questions. Often the platforms are quite big with multiple sites in multiple geographic locations. So ultimately, in addition to the generalizability of the host trials, it also helps with the generalizability of our SWATs as well. Large trial teams, we've talked a lot about how early career researchers can potentially get involved in platforms. And I think that SWATs are a really unique opportunity for trainees and ECRs to contribute. And then platform trials typically already have that embedded culture of adaptation and innovation. So I think this provides a unique opportunity where trial teams and trial staff are a little bit used to that kind of adaptation and changing in what we're doing. So it might make the SWATs a little bit easier to embed. On the flip side, it's important that we remember that these trials are very complex, and we need to think about that when we're designing our SWATs and thinking about engaging trial staff, but also potential SWAT participants, and try to make things as easy as possible for our participants and staff to understand and limit the burden on those, so that, again, we're not impacting the trial itself by making things even more complicated or confusing. Where we have interim analyses and treatments that are potentially being added or removed, it's really important that in our SWATs we have mechanisms for addressing this. So if we're thinking about something like informed consent, things like videos are really popular for looking at improving the way we communicate. But if there's a treatment that's being added or removed, how are you going to address that in the video that you're using in that SWAT? So really important to consider. And it can also make it challenging to distinguish the effects of the SWAT itself versus changes in the host trial. So trying to conduct our SWATs at a period of relative stability if we can within the platform, or at least documenting and keeping track of those changes really well. And then again, within the platforms where you have that context of perpetual learning, it's also important to remember that those changing contexts ultimately will have an impact on the SWAT. So the SWAT success is really dependent on that of the trial. So if we're thinking of things like the platforms that were conducted during the COVID pandemic, well, there was different waves. So the recruitment for the host trial itself, if it was lower, it's ultimately going to impact our recruitment to our SWAT. So making sure we're thinking about that, and also thinking about the logistical requirements and the feasibility of training additional sites that are coming on, or trial personnel changes when some of these things can get quite big. So for the last few moments, I'd like to just share some of my hopefully considerations or suggestions from experience running a SWAT in a complex trial. So I won't speak about the trial too much. Several others, including Dr. Marshall, have talked about the REMAP-CAP trial. And I had the pleasure of working with the REMAP-CAP team to conduct a mixed methods SWAT. And I won't talk about that in too much detail either, but our objective here was to co-design and pilot test an infographic as a supplement to the standard consent process for REMAP-CAP. The first thing that I wanted to share that I think is really important, similar to the host trials themselves, but for our SWATs, is that we're engaging diverse leadership teams. So on screen here, you'll see the wonderful team that I had the pleasure of working with for this SWAT. And this included patients, families, trial staff, investigators. And I really think that diverse team is what was critical to making this SWAT not only successful, but also relevant and applicable to the different individuals who were involved. It's also important for our SWATs that we ask questions that matter. So similar to our clinical trials, if we're asking questions that aren't relevant to clinicians or trialists or patients, I think once again, we're going to be back to that situation where we're contributing to research waste. So really trying to ask important and meaningful questions. And Dr. Marshall had the vision to engage patients and families in REMAP-CAP and essentially look to them to identify aspects of the trial processes that could potentially be adapted or improved to be more patient and family-centric, and that's ultimately how we landed on informed consent. It's important from my perspective and experience that you engage your research ethics boards early when you're thinking about your SWATs. As I mentioned, they might need independent approval, but when you're looking at providing things like participant materials or looking at adding things to the consent process, I think if you can have someone from the research ethics board at the table very early, helps if this could be the board of record for the host trial. I think it's going to make things a little bit more streamlined for you. Again, similar to clinical trials, I think with SWATs, it's also still really important that we look at pilot and feasibility work where we can. So as I mentioned, the SWAT that I was involved in was a pilot and feasibility study, and we certainly learned a lot from conducting that pilot work that ultimately would inform a future implementation study that I don't think would be successful had we not done the pilot work. So really important that we can do that foundational work in this area as well. As I mentioned, minimizing disruptions to the host trial is super important, and I think this is a really unique opportunity where if you have that diverse leadership team, like frontline research coordinators, they can really help inform what you're doing and make sure that it's going to be something that works with what they're already doing for the host trial, as opposed to making things more complicated and more challenging. And lastly, I think we have a really unique opportunity when you're running a SWAT in a platform trial that's already up and going. You already know who your sites are, you know how they're recruiting, you know how the individuals at that sites. So I think it's a unique opportunity to choose who you involve and when. So if you're conducting a SWAT that might not be at all sites, then you could choose who you involve. So there might be sites that are particularly high recruiters. We had some sites with really enthusiastic research coordinators who ultimately made it happen. So really unique. And I think if you are doing it at all sites, then you could choose sort of who you start with and how you go about that. And lastly, I just wanted to share that I think it's really important that we recognize that SWATs aren't something that can be done or should be done off the side of someone's desk. So I think there is increasing recognition that the trial processes themselves are critically important. And I was very fortunate to do this work as part of my dissertation, and it's ultimately led to several collaborations nationally and internationally, several of whom are in the room right now, and has led to a program of work that would not have come to be otherwise. So I think really recognizing that is important, especially for trainees and early career researchers. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again and look forward to the discussion.